In the personal archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society, preserved within a temperature-controlled vault that houses some of the most significant photographic documents of the 20th century, exists an image that has become synonymous with the deceptive nature of human emotion and the terrible secrets that can hide behind even the most radiant expressions of joy. The photograph, taken on the afternoon of June 15, 1940, shows 22-year-old Catherine Louise Morrison standing in the garden of her family's farmhouse outside the small town of Millfield, Wisconsin, her face illuminated by what appears to be one of the most genuine and beautiful smiles ever captured on film. The image radiates warmth and happiness with an intensity that seems to transcend the limitations of photographic technology. Catherine stands among the blooming roses that her mother had planted the previous spring, her auburn hair catching the golden afternoon sunlight, her green eyes sparkling with what observers have consistently described as pure, unbridled joy. She wears a simple yellow summer dress that complements her natural coloring, and her posture suggests a young woman who is completely at peace with herself and her place in the world. The photograph was taken by Robert Sterling, a traveling photographer who had built a modest reputation documenting family celebrations and significant life events throughout rural Wisconsin during the late 1930s and early 1940s. Sterling had been commissioned by Catherine's parents, Thomas and Margaret Morrison, to capture what they believed would be a celebration of their daughter's engagement to James Fletcher, a young man from a prominent local family who had proposed marriage just 1 week earlier. According to Sterling's detailed notes, which were discovered along with the original photographic plates in his estate papers 50 years after his death, Catherine had insisted on this particular pose and location despite her parents' preference for a more formal indoor portrait. She had specifically requested to be photographed among the roses, claiming that the garden represented everything she loved most about her childhood home and the life she had built in Millfield. What makes this photograph extraordinary is not simply the technical quality of Sterling's work or the natural beauty of his subject, but the terrible irony that has only become apparent through decades of historical research and the gradual revelation of the circumstances that surrounded that seemingly perfect summer afternoon. The smile that has captivated viewers for over 8 decades was not an expression of happiness or joy, but rather the most heartbreaking performance of emotional deception ever captured on film. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of social psychology at the University of Wisconsin, who has spent the last 15 years studying the Morrison photograph as part of her research into the psychological mechanisms people employ to cope with devastating trauma, discovered the truth behind Catherine's radiant expression through a painstaking analysis of family documents, medical records, and previously sealed court files that were only made available to researchers in 2019. According to Dr. Vasquez's findings, Catherine Morrison had not been posing for an engagement photograph on that June afternoon in 1940. Instead, she had been struggling to maintain her composure and sanity in the aftermath of receiving news that would destroy everything she had believed about her life, her family, and her future. The smile that had fooled everyone present during the photo session, including her own parents and the photographer himself, was actually a desperate attempt to hide the complete emotional devastation that was threatening to consume her from within. The devastating news had arrived earlier that morning in the form of a telephone call from Dr. William Hartwell, the family physician who had been treating Catherine for what her parents believed was a minor respiratory ailment that had persisted throughout the spring of 1940. Dr. Hartwell had requested that Catherine come to his office immediately to discuss the results of recent medical tests, but when she arrived, she discovered that the doctor had also summoned her fiancé, James Fletcher, and his parents to witness what he clearly believed would be a significant announcement. What doctor? Hartwell revealed that mourning would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Catherine's life and ultimately lead to one of the most tragic sequences of events in Millfield's history. The medical tests that he had conducted had not been routine examinations for respiratory problems, but rather comprehensive diagnostic procedures designed to investigate symptoms that he had observed during Catherine's previous visits, but had been reluctant to discuss with her family. Catherine Morrison was dying. The symptoms that her family had dismissed as a lingering cold were actually the early stages of tuberculosis, a disease that had already progressed to a point where medical intervention would be largely ineffective. Dr. Hartwell estimated that she had perhaps 6 months to live, possibly less if the infection continued to spread at its current rate. The diagnosis was devastating enough on its own, but Dr. Hartwell had additional information that made the situation exponentially worse. Catherine's tuberculosis was highly contagious, and she had almost certainly been spreading the infection to everyone with whom she had come into close contact during the previous several months. This included not only her family members and friends, but also James Fletcher, the man she was planning to marry. The immediate response from James and his family was exactly what Catherine had feared, but had been unable to prevent herself from expecting. James Fletcher, who had proclaimed his undying love just 1 week earlier and had spoken eloquently about their future together, announced that their engagement was terminated effective immediately. His parents supported this decision, citing their responsibility to protect their son's health and their family's reputation within the community. But the cruelest blow came when Dr. Hartwell explained the additional precautions that would be necessary to prevent further spread of the infection. Catherine would need to be isolated from her family and friends, possibly quarantined in a sanatorium hundreds of miles from Millfield, where she would spend her remaining months surrounded by strangers while slowly dying from a disease that would rob her of her strength, her beauty, and ultimately her life. The impact of this news on Catherine's psychological state was immediate and profound. According to witness accounts discovered in Dr. Hartwell's private files, she had remained completely silent throughout the entire consultation, showing no external reaction to information that had reduced both her family and her former fiancé to tears. She had simply nodded politely when the doctor finished speaking, thanked him for his honesty, and walked out of his office with the same dignified composure that had characterized her behavior throughout her life. What happened next reveals the extraordinary strength of character that allowed Catherine Morrison to create one of the most convincing performances of happiness ever documented. Rather than collapsing under the weight of her diagnosis or retreating into the privacy of her family home to grieve for the life she would never have, Catherine made a conscious decision to spend her final day in Millfield behaving exactly as she would have if she had received the happiest news imaginable. She returned home and informed her parents that she wanted to commemorate her engagement with a professional photograph, claiming that James had suggested they capture the moment for posterity before he left town on business that would keep him away for several weeks. Thomas and Margaret Morrison, who had not yet been informed of their daughter's diagnosis, were delighted by this suggestion and immediately contacted Robert Sterling to arrange for the session. Catherine spent the rest of the morning preparing for the photograph with the same meticulous attention to detail that she had always applied to important occasions. She selected her most flattering dress, arranged her hair in the style that James had once complimented, and practiced her smile in the mirror until she could produce an expression of radiant happiness on command, regardless of the emotional turmoil that was destroying her from within. The performance she delivered during the actual photo session was so convincing that neither her parents nor Robert Sterling suspected anything was amiss. Sterling's notes described Catherine as being unusually animated and joyful, noting that she seemed to glow with an inner light that made her appear more beautiful than he had ever seen her. He attributed this radiance to the natural happiness of a young woman in love, unaware that he was actually documenting one of the most heartbreaking examples of human courage and emotional sacrifice ever captured on film. The smile that Catherine produced for the camera was not a spontaneous expression of joy, but rather the result of a conscious act of will that required her to suppress every natural emotional response to her situation. She had decided that if this photograph was to be the final record of her life in Millfield, if this image was what her family and friends would remember of her after she was gone, then she would ensure that it showed her at her most beautiful and happy, even if that happiness was entirely artificial. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Catherine to maintain this facade were analyzed by Dr. Vasquez using modern techniques for understanding trauma response and emotional regulation. According to her research, Catherine was employing what psychologists now recognize as a form of protective dissociation, essentially separating her conscious mind from the emotional reality of her situation in order to function during an impossible circumstance. This dissociative state allowed Catherine to access genuine memories of happiness and contentment, recreating the emotional and physical expressions associated with those memories even while her deeper consciousness was fully aware of the terrible truth about her condition. The result was a smile that registered as completely authentic to observers because it was based on real emotional experiences, even though it was being artificially generated in response to the most devastating news of her life. The photograph session concluded in the late afternoon, and Robert Sterling departed with promises to deliver the finished portraits within a week. Catherine bid farewell to her parents with the same warm affection she had always shown them, gave no indication that anything was amiss, and retired to her room with the explanation that she was feeling tired and wanted to rest before dinner. What happened during the hours that followed has been reconstructed through a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and Catherine's own written account, which was discovered hidden within the pages of her childhood diary decades after her death. The story that emerges is one of a young woman who maintained her emotional disguise until the very end, protecting her family from the full horror of her situation while ensuring that their final memories of her would be untainted by the knowledge of her suffering. Catherine spent her last evening writing a series of letters that would not be discovered until her room was cleaned out several days later. The first letter was addressed to her parents, explaining her diagnosis and her decision to spare them the agony of watching her slowly die from tuberculosis. She expressed her gratitude for the love and care they had given her throughout her life, asked for their forgiveness for the deception she had been forced to employ, and requested that they remember her as she had been in the photograph, rather than as she would have become during the final stages of her illness. The second letter was written to James Fletcher, releasing him from any obligation he might have felt regarding their engagement and expressing her understanding of his decision to protect himself and his family from exposure to her disease. She wrote with remarkable grace and forgiveness about a situation that might have driven others to bitter recrimination, demonstrating the same emotional strength that had allowed her to smile so convincingly during the afternoon's photo session. The final letter was addressed to Dr. Hartwell, thanking him for his honesty and explaining her decision to take control of her remaining time rather than submit to the isolation and gradual deterioration that awaited her in a distant sanatorium. She had concluded that a quick and dignified death would be preferable to months of suffering that would serve no purpose other than to prolong the inevitable while causing additional pain to everyone who cared about her. Catherine Morrison died that night, approximately 12 hours after posing for what would become one of the most studied photographs in the history of American portraiture. She had consumed a carefully calculated dose of barbiturates that she had been secretly accumulating from various sources over the previous several months, apparently in anticipation of a situation exactly like the one she now faced. Her body was discovered the following morning by her mother, who found Catherine lying peacefully in her bed, dressed in her favorite nightgown and appearing for all the world as if she had simply passed away in her sleep. The suicide note, hidden within her diary, was not found until several days later, when the family was going through her belongings to prepare for the funeral. The immediate reaction of the Millfield community to Catherine's death was shock and grief, but these emotions were compounded by fear when Dr. Hartwell was forced to reveal the true circumstances surrounding her passing. The knowledge that tuberculosis had been present in their community and that Catherine had been unknowingly spreading the infection during the weeks before her diagnosis created a panic that resulted in the temporary quarantine of several families and the closure of various businesses and gathering places. Medical testing revealed that Catherine had indeed infected several people during her final weeks, including 2 of her closest friends and a neighbor who had spent considerable time in the Morrison household. Fortunately, these cases were detected early enough for treatment to be effective, and no additional deaths resulted from the outbreak. However, the fear and suspicion that gripped Millfield during the months following Catherine's death fundamentally changed the character of the community and destroyed many of the social relationships that had defined small-town life in rural Wisconsin. The Morrison family was devastated not only by the loss of their daughter, but also by the knowledge that her final act had been a performance designed to protect them from the truth about her condition. Thomas Morrison, in particular, was haunted by the realization that he had been completely deceived by Catherine's apparent happiness during her final day, and he spent the remainder of his life wondering whether he might have been able to provide her with some form of comfort or support if he had known what she was truly experiencing. Margaret Morrison's reaction was somewhat different. Focusing on her admiration for her daughter's courage and strength in the face of impossible circumstances. She kept Robert Sterling's photograph prominently displayed in their home for the rest of her life, telling visitors that it captured Catherine exactly as she had been, beautiful, strong, and determined to protect the people she loved, regardless of the personal cost. The photograph itself took on additional significance as the true story of its creation became known within the community. What had originally been intended as a simple engagement portrait became a symbol of the complexity of human emotion and the extraordinary lengths to which people will go to protect others from unnecessary pain. The image was reproduced in local newspapers and eventually found its way into historical collections as an example of both photographic artistry and human resilience. Robert Sterling, the photographer, was profoundly affected by the revelation of what he had actually captured during that June afternoon in 1940. His notes, written years later, describe his amazement at Catherine's ability to project such convincing happiness while experiencing what must have been overwhelming despair. He credited the photograph with teaching him to look more carefully at his subjects, recognizing that the expressions he captured might be more complex and meaningful than they initially appeared. The psychological analysis of Catherine's final performance has provided valuable insights into the mechanisms people employ to cope with terminal diagnoses and other forms of devastating news. Dr. Vasquez's research has identified the Morrison photograph as a unique example of what she terms protective performance, a psychological strategy in which individuals consciously create false emotional displays in order to shield others from the full impact of traumatic information. This protective performance requires an extraordinary level of emotional control and psychological strength, as the individual must simultaneously process their own trauma while maintaining a convincing facade of normalcy or happiness. The fact that Catherine was able to sustain this performance for an entire day, including during the extended period required for a formal photograph session, demonstrates a level of emotional sophistication and personal courage that few people possess. Modern psychological research has revealed that Catherine's response to her diagnosis was actually quite rare, as most individuals facing terminal illness go through predictable stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance that make sustained emotional performance extremely difficult. The fact that Catherine was able to bypass these natural responses in order to protect her family suggests that she possessed an unusually mature understanding of death and a remarkably selfless approach to her own suffering. The medical aspects of Catherine's case have also been studied extensively, particularly her decision to end her life rather than undergo the treatments that were available in 1940. While tuberculosis was often fatal during this period, some patients did survive with proper medical care, and Catherine might have lived for several additional months or even years if she had chosen to fight the disease. However, medical historians have noted that tuberculosis treatment in 1940 was both primitive and extremely unpleasant, often involving isolation in distant sanatoriums where patients were subjected to experimental procedures that caused significant suffering without guaranteeing positive outcomes. Catherine's decision to avoid this ordeal, while tragic, was not entirely unreasonable given the medical knowledge and treatment options available at the time. The social aspects of Catherine's story reflect the attitudes toward illness and death that characterized American society during the early 1940s. Tuberculosis carried a significant social stigma, and families affected by the disease often faced ostracism and economic hardship as communities sought to protect themselves from infection. Catherine's awareness of these social consequences likely influenced her decision to conceal her diagnosis and her ultimate choice to end her life before the disease could progress to its more visible and socially destructive stages. The impact of Catherine's story on the Millfield community extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of her death. The photograph became a focal point for discussions about honesty, sacrifice, and the limits of personal responsibility when facing terminal illness. Some community members praised Catherine's courage and selflessness, while others questioned whether her deception had ultimately caused more harm than good by preventing her family from providing appropriate support during her final hours. These debates continued for decades, with each new generation of Millfield residents bringing fresh perspectives to the interpretation of Catherine's actions and their moral implications. The photograph served as a constant reminder of the complexity of human relationships and the difficult choices that people must sometimes make when trying to balance their own needs against their desire to protect others from suffering. The preservation and study of the Morrison photograph has contributed to broader understanding of American social history during the early 1940s, particularly the ways in which families and communities dealt with illness, death, and social stigma during a period of significant cultural transition. The image has been featured in numerous academic publications and museum exhibitions as an example of both photographic artistry and social documentation. Perhaps most significantly, Catherine's story has provided insight into the psychological mechanisms that allow individuals to maintain hope and dignity in the face of impossible circumstances. Her ability to create genuine appearing happiness during her darkest hour demonstrates the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to inspire extraordinary acts of courage and selflessness. The technical analysis of the photograph itself has revealed additional layers of meaning that were not apparent to its original viewers. Modern digital enhancement techniques have shown that Catherine's smile, while convincing, displays subtle signs of the tremendous effort required to maintain her emotional facade. Micro-expressions visible in high-resolution scans suggest the presence of underlying tension and sadness that only become apparent when the image is subjected to detailed analysis. These technical findings have supported Dr. Vasquez's psychological analysis, providing objective evidence for the theoretical framework she has developed to understand protective performance as a coping mechanism. The Morrison photograph has become a key piece of evidence in her research, demonstrating that even the most convincing emotional displays may conceal complex internal experiences that tell very different stories about an individual's psychological state. The legacy of Catherine Morrison and her remarkable final photograph continues to evolve as new generations encounter her story and bring fresh perspectives to its interpretation. What remains constant is the power of her image to move viewers and challenge assumptions about the relationship between external appearance and internal experience. In an age when social media and digital communication have made the performance of happiness increasingly common and sophisticated, Catherine's story serves as a reminder that the pressure to maintain positive appearances can sometimes extract a terrible psychological toll. Her photograph stands as both a beautiful work of art and a cautionary tale about the dangers of emotional isolation and the importance of authentic human connection, even in the darkest of circumstances. The girl's radiant smile from that sunny June afternoon in 1940 continues to captivate and disturb viewers more than 8 decades after it was captured, serving as a permanent testament to the complexity of human emotion and the extraordinary courage that ordinary people can display when faced with impossible circumstances. Behind that beautiful expression lies a story of love, sacrifice, and the terrible choices that people sometimes must make when trying to protect others from the full weight of human suffering. The true meaning of Catherine Morrison's smile remains as complex and challenging today as it was in 1940, but we want to know your thoughts. Use the comment section below and tell us what you believe about the ethics of emotional deception and whether Catherine made the right choice in her final hours. If you're fascinated by unraveling the secrets behind history's most compelling photographs, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, because there are many more stories waiting to be uncovered, hidden behind images that seem to tell one story while concealing another entirely.